Ash coated the marble floors of the Imperial Sanctum, thick enough to muffle the heavy boots of the Conqueror. 5,731 small lives had just been erased from the ledgers of humanity. Yet, the absolute ruler of 1,000 worlds was about to freeze. Emperor Conrad hated the smell of the flagship's recycled air. It always carried a faint, undeniable undertone of copper and ozone, a metallic tang that sat heavy at the back of the throat. Today, that smell was worse. It wasn't just the atmospheric scrubbers failing to filter out the orbital exhaust. It was the psychological weight of what had just happened below, seeping through the blast shields. The planetary bombardment was over. Conrad stood before the primary viewing aperture. He didn't clasp his hands behind his back. He didn't strike a pose of triumphant conquest. He just stood there, leaning slightly against the cold, reinforced glass, feeling the subtle, rhythmic vibrations of the ship's massive fusion drives humming beneath the floor plates. His uniform, a severe cut of charcoal wool, felt too tight around his collar. He ran a gloved thumb over the edge of the control console. Dust. Already. The kinetic impact of the orbital strikes had kicked up so much particulate matter into the upper atmosphere that the planet below looked like a bruised plum, swathed in violently swirling bands of grey and sickly orange. 5,731. The logistics engine had tallied the biosignatures as they blinked out. The process had taken exactly 11 minutes. Sector 4 was an academy colony, a nursery world. There were no planetary defense cannons down there, no shipyards, just vast, sprawling complexes of agricultural domes and schools. Conrad swallowed. His throat was dry. He reached for a crystal tumbler on the side table, the ice clinking loudly in the absolute silence of the bridge. He took a sip of water. It tasted like nothing, which somehow made the copper tang in his nose worse. He wasn't a monster. That was the phrase he kept repeating in the dark, quiet spaces of his own mind. He was an administrator. The human insurrection had dragged on for 6 grueling years. They were a pestilence of a species, stubborn, illogical, breeding and expanding with a chaotic fervour that defied imperial metrics. Every time the imperial fleets crushed a human armada, 3 more ragtag flotillas of retrofitted freighters and mining skiffs appeared in a neighbouring sector. They didn't understand the concept of a tactical surrender. They bled, they died, and they multiplied. Gregory, the chief tactician, had presented the math 2 weeks ago. The war was draining the Empire's economic reserves by 4% annually. The human supply lines were impossible to track because they didn't rely on centralised nodes. They relied on localised fanaticism. To end a weed, you do not trim the leaves, Gregory had said, tapping a stylus against a digital map of the human colonies. You salt the soil. We target their future. We show them a violence so absolute, so devoid of military honour, that their morale shatters. We must break their biological imperative to protect their young. Conrad had signed the order. He hadn't slept since. Behind him, the pneumatic hiss of the bridge doors breaking their seal made him flinch. He masked the twitch by setting his glass down. The sound of heavy boots against the grated deck approached. "My Emperor!" Gregory's voice was crisp, entirely unaffected. "The sector is pacified. The thermal blooms are fading. The human prisoner has been prepared for the broadcast." Conrad turned slowly. He looked at Gregory. The tactician's uniform was immaculate. There wasn't a hair out of place. It made Conrad feel a sudden, irrational surge of disgust. "Bring him in," Conrad said. His voice sounded thin. He cleared his throat and repeated it, slightly louder. "Bring him in. Bring." 2 Imperial guards, towering figures in matte black composite armour, dragged a man through the blast doors. They didn't march him. They simply held him by his armpits, letting his boots drag uselessly across the floor. They dropped him in the centre of the command deck. The man hit the grating with a dull, heavy thud. He didn't try to catch himself. He just lay there for a moment, a tangled pile of stained canvas coveralls and bruised limbs. Conrad stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply. He looked down. The prisoner's name was Thomas Reed. He was nobody. just a civilian traffic controller they had pulled from a crippled human transport ship a week ago. He was meant to be the conduit, the face the Empire would broadcast to the remaining human worlds. They would show Thomas the destruction of the nursery world, record his broken, weeping submission, and transmit it on all frequencies. A broadcast of total, undeniable despair. Thomas pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His left knee joint popped. A loud, wet sound in the quiet room. He didn't look up immediately. He was trembling. It wasn't a heroic, defiant shake of suppressed rage. It was the uncontrollable, pathetic shivering of a man going into deep systemic shock. Conrad smelled him before he spoke. Stale sweat, unwashed hair, and the sharp, acidic reek of dried vomit. Thomas looked terrible. His cheek was heavily bruised, swollen shut over his left eye. A slow, viscous trail of blood leaked from his nose, tracking through the grime on his face and pooling in the stubble on his chin. "Look at the screen, human!" Gregory commanded, stepping beside Conrad. Thomas didn't move. He kept his remaining good eye fixed on the steel grating beneath his hands. He was panting short, shallow breaths that hissed through his teeth. One of the guards stepped forward and kicked Thomas in the ribs. It wasn't a killing blow, just a sharp, professional strike designed to compel obedience. Thomas groaned, a pathetic animal sound, and collapsed onto his side. He curled inward, clutching his chest, coughing violently. The cough was wet and ugly. He spat a wad of dark saliva onto the pristine floor. Conrad felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. This was messy. He wanted a clean psychological victory. He wanted the man to break, to weep, to beg for mercy. He didn't want to watch a civilian choke on his own fluids. "Stand him up," Conrad ordered. The guards hauled Thomas to his feet. They wrenched his head back, forcing him to face the massive reinforced window. Outside, the bruised plum of the planet continued to burn. "Do you know what that was, Thomas?" Conrad asked. He kept his tone even, conversational. He needed to project absolute control. That was Sector 4, the agricultural belts, the primary educational facilities for your outer colonies. Thomas stared at the glass. He blinked slowly. A drop of blood fell from his chin and hit the collar of his shirt. 5,731, Conrad stated, rolling the numbers off his tongue, trying to find the cold detachment he had used when signing the order. Gone. Evaporated. They didn't feel pain. It was too fast for that. A simple, efficient erasure. Conrad stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space. He could see the intricate network of burst capillaries in the human's good eye. "We are not doing this out of cruelty," Conrad lied softly. "We are doing this to save time. Your resistance is a statistical anomaly. It cannot last, but it costs us resources. So, we are changing the equation. We will no longer fight your soldiers. We will simply erase what your soldiers are fighting for. Surrender the remaining fleets, and the bombardments stop. Continue, and the next nursery world burns tomorrow." Conrad paused, waiting for the reaction. The psychological profile of humans dictated a complete emotional collapse at this juncture. The destruction of their offspring was supposed to trigger a paralyzing wave of grief and hopelessness. Thomas kept staring at the planet, his chest heaved. He swallowed hard, visibly wincing as the movement aggravated his bruised throat. "Say something," Gregory snapped, holding up a small recording drone that hovered near Thomas's face. "The broadcast is live. Speak to your people. Tell them it's over." Thomas didn't cry. He didn't scream. He slowly turned his head, breaking his gaze away from the burning world, and looked at Conrad. The silence on the bridge stretched, becoming brittle. The hum of the fusion drive seemed to grow louder, vibrating up through the soles of Conrad's boots. Thomas looked at the Emperor. The human's expression wasn't stoic. It was vacant. The pupils of his eyes were dilated, swallowing the iris. He looked like a man who had just been woken from a deep sleep by a loud noise, unable to comprehend his surroundings. "Are you deaf, human?" Gregory sneered, stepping forward. He raised a hand, ready to signal the guards for another strike. "Wait," Conrad murmured, holding up 2 fingers. He wanted this. He needed the raw, unedited reaction. He watched Thomas's face intently. Thomas licked his cracked lips. His tongue was coated in a greyish film. He shifted his weight, his injured knee trembling violently under the strain. He looked at Gregory, then back to Conrad. The vacancy in his expression was slowly beginning to curdle into something else. It wasn't the fiery, righteous anger of a hero in a propaganda film. It was a sickened, exhausted disgust. "You—" Thomas started. His voice was a raspy whisper. It broke on the first syllable. He stopped, cleared his throat, and winced again. "You tracked the biosignatures." Conrad frowned slightly. "Our logistics engines are precise." 5,000? 700? Thomas mumbled, his gaze drifting toward the floor. He swayed slightly. One of the guards tightened his grip on Thomas's shoulder, keeping him upright. "And 31, Conrad provided, feeling a strange need to ensure the number was accurate. Thomas let out a breath that sounded like a dry chuckle, but his face remained completely slack. He looked back up at Conrad. The dilated pupils seemed to focus, pinning the Emperor in place. "My daughter was down there," Thomas said. The words didn't come out as a wail. They dropped from his mouth like lead weights hitting a wooden floor. Dull, heavy, absolute. Conrad felt a sudden sharp coldness in his stomach. He hadn't known that. The selection of the prisoner had been random, handled by the intelligence division. He quickly masked his reaction, keeping his face perfectly still. "Then you, more than anyone, understand the cost of this war. Tell them to surrender." Thomas didn't seem to hear him. He was looking past Conrad, staring at the polished metal of the bulkhead. "Her name was Sarah," Thomas whispered. He wasn't talking to the Emperor. He was talking to the empty air. "She was 7. She had a loose tooth. Front right. She kept pushing it with her tongue. It drove her mother crazy." Gregory shifted impatiently. "We don't need a eulogy. We need a surrender. Guards?" "Quiet," Conrad snapped, surprising himself with the harshness in his own voice. He looked back at Thomas. The human was unspooling. The psychological break was happening, just not in the loud, dramatic way the manuals predicted. It was a quiet, internal collapse. "She hated the colour yellow," Thomas continued, his voice monotone, his breathing shallow. "Said it looked like sick. We bought her a yellow raincoat for the monsoon season. She refused to wear it. Walked to the transport rail in the pouring rain. Got soaked. Caught a fever. I yelled at her." Thomas stopped. His good eye blinked rapidly. A single tear, cutting a clean track through the grime on his cheek, fell and vanished into the collar of his coveralls. "I yelled at her for being stupid," he whispered. Conrad watched the man intently. He felt a profound sense of unease. This wasn't victory. This felt like watching a structural support beam slowly buckle under impossible weight. You knew it was going to snap, but the anticipation was agonizing. "Humanity operates on sentiment," Conrad said, trying to steer the interaction back to his tactical narrative. "It is your greatest weakness. You tie your logic to fragile, temporary things. We have simply removed the object of your sentiment. The war is now pointless." Thomas finally focused entirely on Conrad. The human's posture shifted. The trembling didn't stop, but it changed frequency. It wasn't shock anymore. The slack, vacant expression was gone. The muscles in Thomas's jaw bunched. He pulled his shoulders back just a fraction of an inch, testing the grip of the armoured guards holding him. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like an accountant who had been beaten in an alley. But there was a sudden, terrifying density to him. "You think," Thomas breathed, the rasp in his voice deepening, "you think you removed the sentiment." "We removed the future," Gregory interjected coldly. "You have nothing left to fight for." Thomas let out another of those dry, broken chuckles. It was a horrible sound. It scraped against the quiet of the bridge. He looked at Gregory, a brief flicker of profound pity crossing his battered face, before returning his gaze to the Emperor. "You really don't get it," Thomas said. His voice was growing stronger, shedding the whisper. "You read our history files. You studied our tactics, you mapped our supply lines, but you didn't look at us." Conrad felt a bead of sweat form at his hairline. He didn't wipe it away. "Explain." Thomas leaned forward as much as the guards would allow. He smelled of copper and ruin. "We fight for our kids," Thomas said, his words slow and deliberate. "We build the ships. We man the guns. We die in the dark so they don't have to. We followed rules. We took prisoners. We respected medical ships. We engaged your fleets in open space." Thomas paused. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "We did all of that," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying vibrating register, "because we needed to look them in the eye when we came home. We needed to be human for them." Conrad felt his heart skip a beat. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. He looked at the logistics screen, at the fading thermal blooms on the planet below. He looked back at Thomas. The human wasn't crying anymore. The single tear track was drying. His eye was dry, bloodshot, and utterly devoid of anything resembling fear or despair. It was a dead, flat stare. The stare of a man who had just realized his house was completely empty and he no longer needed to worry about breaking the china. "You didn't break our spirit," Thomas said softly. "You just took away our only reason to hold back." The silence that followed was suffocating. The hum of the ship's engines felt intrusive, almost deafening in the stillness of the bridge. Gregory scoffed, a short, dismissive sound that fell flat. "Empty threats from a broken man. You are defeated. You are prisoners of physics and attrition." Thomas didn't even look at the tactician. He kept his eyes locked on Conrad. The Emperor felt a strange urge to look away, to break the eye contact, but his pride anchored him in place. Conrad analysed the man's face. He searched for the lie, the bluff. He looked for the desperation of a cornered animal trying to sound larger than it was. But he found nothing. Thomas's face was a mask of cold, terrifying certainty. It was the look of a man who had already calculated the exact trajectory of the coming storm. "Do you know what happens now?" Thomas asked. The conversational tone was gone. It was an interrogation. "You will transmit your surrender," Conrad said. But his voice lacked the absolute authority it had held 5 minutes ago. It sounded defensive. Thomas smiled. It was a grotesque, lopsided thing, stretching his bruised cheek and pulling at the dried blood around his mouth. "No," Thomas said simply. "I won't, and neither will they." He gestured vaguely with his chin toward the viewport, toward the vast, dark expanse of space beyond the burning planet. "For 6 years," Thomas said, "we've been fighting a defensive war. We were trying to protect infrastructure. We were trying to evacuate populations. We were trying to survive. We built armor. We built shields." Thomas leaned back slightly, letting his dead weight hang in the grip of the guards. He seemed suddenly relaxed, as if a massive, unbearable tension had just been cut from his spine. "You just freed us," Thomas whispered. Conrad's mind raced. He ran through the tactical simulations, the logistics algorithms. The humans were vastly outnumbered. Their industrial capacity was a fraction of the Empire's. They couldn't win a war of annihilation. It was mathematically impossible. "You have no fleets left capable of an offensive," Gregory stated, stepping closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm. "You're isolated." We don't need fleets," Thomas said, his gaze never leaving Conrad's. "We have freighters, we have mining lasers, we have rocks, we have slip-space drives, and no overriding safety protocols." Conrad felt the coldness in his stomach spread, creeping up into his chest. He understood. He suddenly, horrifyingly understood what the human was implying. The Empire relied on massive centralized hubs, Dyson swarms, orbital tethers, densely populated capital worlds. They were stationary. They were safe because the rules of engagement dictated that slip-space jumps within a gravity well were suicidal and tactically unsound. It destroyed the ship and cracked the planet's crust. It was madness. It was a tactic only a species with absolutely nothing left to lose would employ. "You wouldn't," Conrad breathed. The words slipped out before he could stop them. "It would be mutual annihilation." Thomas's smile faded. The deadness in his eyes seemed to crystallize, hardening into something sharp and brilliant. "You killed Sarah," Thomas stated. It wasn't a lament. It was a statement of historical fact, the turning point of an era. He pulled himself up, using the guard's grip as leverage. He didn't care about his knee anymore. He stood as tall as he could, looking the Emperor of 1,000 worlds dead in the eye. The recording drone hovered inches from Thomas's face, its red light blinking steadily. Millions of humans hidden in asteroid belts, huddled in stealth, baffled transports, listening on illicit frequencies, were waiting for him to speak. They were waiting for the grief, the tears, the surrender. Thomas took a deep, rattling breath. He didn't offer a grand speech. He didn't scream obscenities. He didn't curse the Emperor's name. He looked into the lens of the drone, seeing the faces of every surviving human staring back at him. He saw the parents, the mechanics, the miners, the desperate, exhausted remnants of his species, and he gave them the only command left. Run. He didn't mean run away. Conrad saw it in the twitch of Thomas's jaw. He saw it in the sudden, predatory stillness that washed over the battered prisoner. It wasn't a command to flee, it was the starting gun. Run the engines hot. Run the reactors past critical. Run the freighters into the tethers. The word hung in the air, a single syllable. It didn't echo, but it felt as though it had shattered the reinforced glass of the viewport. Thomas slumped forward, the last of his adrenaline spent. The guards caught him, but he was dead weight again. His eyes were closed. "Cut the feed!" Gregory shouted, his perfect composure finally breaking. He swatted the drone out of the air. It crashed against the deck, sparking once before dying. Cut the signal. It was too late. The silence returned to the bridge, but it was a different silence now. It wasn't the quiet of a graveyard. It was the terrifying, breathless pause before a tsunami hits the shoreline. Conrad slowly turned back to the window. The planet below was still burning. 5,731. It had been a tactical calculation, a master stroke of psychological warfare. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He saw the immaculate uniform, the polished insignia, and he saw the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his right hand. He had wanted to break a species. Instead, he had just unchained a monster. Deep in the bowels of the flagship, a proximity alarm began to wail. It wasn't a massive fleet jumping into the sector. It was a single, unregistered mining vessel, its transponder off, hurtling out of the dark on a direct suicidal collision course with the Empire's nearest orbital tether. It was the first. Conrad closed his eyes. The smell of ozone and copper was suddenly overwhelming. He had thought he was writing the final chapter of the war. He hadn't realized he had just written the prologue to the end of his empire. The proximity alarm did not roar. It shrieked. It was a high, thin, mechanical needle of sound designed to cut through the heavy lethargy of deep space travel. It drilled directly into the base of Conrad's skull. The primary viewport automatically polarized, tinting the glass a heavy, bruised purple to protect the bridge crew from sudden thermal flashes. "Report," Conrad said. The word felt thick in his mouth. "Unidentified mass," Hastings, the senior sensor operator, stammered. The young officer's fingers flew across his haptic console, leaving smears of nervous sweat on the glass. "Vector is... it's direct. Sol system mining rig. Class 4 hauler. Sir, it's not decelerating. It's burning its primary engines at 140% capacity." Gregory pushed past the communication station, his immaculate posture cracking. "Lock orbital batteries. Vaporize it. It's a single ship, Hastings. Do not panic on my bridge." "I can't get a lock," Hastings' voice cracked. He hit the console with the heel of his hand. They dumped their reactor shielding. The thermal bloom is too wide. The targeting sensors are blinding themselves trying to find the center of mass. Conrad stepped away from the glass. He looked down at Thomas. The human was still slumped between the two armored guards, but his head was tilted up. His good eye caught the strobing red light of the emergency klaxons. He wasn't smiling anymore, he just looked impossibly tired. 50 seconds to impact, Hastings yelled. Impact with what? Gregory demanded, drawing his sidearm as if he could shoot the rogue vessel out of the sky himself. The flagship. Put the forward deflectors to maximum. Not us, sir. Hastings swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. The equatorial tether. They are aiming for the orbital tether. Conrad felt all the air leave his lungs. The tether. It was a braided cord of carbon nanotubes and reinforced glass, 30 miles thick, anchoring the planet's primary shipyard to the surface. It took 60 years to build. It housed 80,000 engineers, administrators, and their families. "Shoot it down!" Gregory roared, the pristine veneer of the tactician shattering into raw, ugly panic. "Manual override! Fire blind into the thermal bloom!" Heavy kinetic batteries along the flagship's hull thumped in a staggered rhythm. The vibrations rattled the crystal tumbler on Conrad's side table, sending it crashing to the floor. The ice scattered across the grey decking. Streaks of superheated tungsten ripped into the dark space between the flagship and the planet. Some found their mark. The tactical display showed the mining vessel shedding mass. Entire chunks of its hull were sheared away by the defensive fire. But it didn't matter. It wasn't a military vessel trying to maintain structural integrity. It was a 50,000-ton bullet. It hit the tether. In the vacuum of space, there was no sound. There was only the brutal, uncaring math of kinetic energy transfer. The viewport filters slammed to maximum opacity, rendering the explosion as a blinding, pure white smear across the glass. The flagship groaned. Even hundreds of miles away, the shockwave of the atmosphere reacting to the tether's destruction hit the shields like a physical blow. The deck heaved. One of the armoured guards holding Thomas lost his footing and fell heavily to one knee. Conrad grabbed the edge of the command console to stay upright. His knuckles were bone white. As the filters slowly adjusted, the devastation became visible. The tether, the unbreakable spine of Imperial industry, was snapped in half. The upper section, attached to the shipyard, was violently whipped outward by centrifugal force, spinning wildly out of control into the dark. The lower section, hundreds of millions of tons of composite metal and glass, succumbed to gravity. It began to fall back toward the burning planet, a dying, fiery snake collapsing onto the atmosphere. 80,000, Gregory whispered, staring at the tactical display. The numbers were scrolling too fast to read. The neat, orderly ledgers of the Empire were bleeding. Conrad looked at Thomas. The prisoner had managed to push himself into a sitting position against the railing. He was coughing again, a wet, rattling sound. He wiped a mixture of saliva and blood from his chin with the back of a filthy sleeve. "I told you," Thomas rasped. He didn't look triumphant, he just looked sick. "We needed a reason to care about the rules." "Sir," Hastings' voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the heavy breathing on the bridge. "Sir, you need to look at the regional map." Conrad turned. The large holographic projector in the center of the room flared to life, replacing the image of the ruined tether with a map of the surrounding Imperial sectors. For a long moment, the map was bathed in the cool, steady blue of Imperial control. Then a single red warning rune flashed on the outer rim. "Unscheduled slip space jump," Hastings read. Leaning so close to his screen, his nose almost touched the glass. "Human freighter. It bypassed the Mandeville limit." "That's suicide," Gregory snapped, his voice shrill. "Jumping that close to a gravity well?" "It didn't jump near the gravity well," Hastings interrupted, turning in his chair. His face was completely bloodless. "It jumped inside it. Atmospheric coordinates over the colony world of Valen. The spatial displacement. Sir, the displacement cracked the planet's tectonic plates. The entire capital city is gone. The freighter was atomized, but the displacement shockwave." Another red rune appeared, then two more. "Mining skiff jumped into the agricultural rings of Sector 9, Hastings said, his voice flattening into the dull monotone of a man reading a list of the dead. "Transport vessel rammed the automated defense platforms at the Helios Gate. Sir, I'm getting reports from the core worlds." Conrad stepped toward the holographic table. He watched the blue map begin to break out in a violent rash of crimson. They weren't military strikes. They were acts of absolute unmitigated spite. The humans weren't trying to win the war anymore. They were taking the board and smashing it over the Empire's head. "Shut down the slip space lanes," Gregory demanded, slamming his fist on the console. "Erect the interdiction fields." "We can't," Conrad said softly. The realization was a block of ice in his stomach. Our empire spans 1,000 worlds. We rely on the lanes for food, for water, for communication. If we shut them down, we starve in a month. "They are destroying themselves," Gregory pointed a trembling finger at Thomas. "This is madness. Every time they pull this maneuver, they lose a ship. They lose their own people." Thomas let out a heavy sigh. He laid his head back against the cold steel of the railing. "We lost our people 11 minutes ago down there in the dirt. The people flying those ships now, they aren't soldiers. They're parents who just watched a live broadcast of an empty nursery." The human slowly pushed himself up, leaning heavily on the guardrail. The armoured guards didn't move to stop him. They were too busy staring at the holographic map, watching their invincible empire bleed from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. "You wanted to do the math," Thomas said, his voice devoid of anger, echoing hollowly in the quiet horror of the bridge. "You took 5,000 kids. We have 4 billion adults left. How many planetary tethers do you have? How many shipyards? Because we have a lot of rusted old freighters." 3 hours passed. The bridge of the flagship smelled like ozone, burnt coffee, and the sharp, sour tang of fear sweat. The emergency lighting had been normalized, but the harsh white glare only served to illuminate the exhaustion on the faces of the crew. No one spoke above a murmur. The only sounds were the quiet, frantic tapping of haptic keys and the relentless rhythmic chirp of incoming casualty reports. The holographic map in the center of the room was no longer blue. It was a chaotic, swirling mess of red warning runes and grey dead zones. Sector by sector, the infrastructure of a 1,000-year-old empire was being dismantled by a swarm of kamikaze ships. Conrad had not moved from his spot near the viewport. He stood perfectly still, his hands finally clasped tightly behind his back. The knuckles were bruised from the strain. He looked out at the planet below. The fires in Sector 4 were burning out, choked by the thick layer of ash they had created. But the debris from the orbital tether was still raining down, drawing bright, violent streaks of light across the upper atmosphere as millions of tons of metal burned upon re-entry. "Emperor!" Conrad didn't turn. He recognized the tone. It was Gregory, but the sharp, crisp authority was gone. It was replaced by a hollow, vibrating tremor. "Speak," Conrad commanded. "The casualty estimates," Gregory started, then stopped. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and abrasive. "The logistics engine cannot process the variables. The humans are not targeting military installations. They are targeting civilian populations, economic centers, water purifiers. They are jumping trash compactors into fusion reactors." "Give me a number, Gregory," Conrad said, his voice flat. 400 million, Gregory whispered. "In the last 3 hours, and rising." "Sir, the Third Fleet is requesting permission to jump to the core worlds to establish a defensive perimeter." "Denied," Conrad said instantly. He finally turned. Gregory looked 10 years older. His uniform was unfastened at the collar, and his eyes were bloodshot. "A defensive perimeter against what? A fleet you can track. They are solitary vessels. They turn off their transponders and burn their engines until they melt. By the time the Third Fleet drops out of slip space, a human garbage scow will ram their flagship. Tell the fleets to hold position." Conrad walked slowly across the bridge, his boots crushing the spilled ice from his dropped tumbler. He stopped in front of Thomas. The human was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest. A medical droid was hovering near him, scanning his ribs, but Thomas waved it away with a weak flick of his wrist. He looked up at Conrad. The swelling around his left eye had darkened to a deep, sickly purple. "Are you satisfied?" Conrad asked. The question wasn't sarcastic. It was a genuine inquiry from a man who had lost his understanding of cause and effect. Thomas rested his chin on his knees. "No, I'm exhausted." "We can stop this," Conrad said, crouching down so he was eye level with the prisoner. The charcoal wool of his uniform bunched at the shoulders. I can broadcast a total surrender. The Empire will withdraw from your sectors. We will pay reparations. It was treason just to speak the words, but Conrad didn't care. The Empire was bleeding to death from 1,000 paper cuts. He needed the bleeding to stop. Thomas stared at him. For a brief second, Conrad thought he saw a flicker of sympathy in the human's good eye, but it vanished instantly, replaced by that same dead, flat stare. You can't, Thomas said softly. You can broadcast whatever you want. They won't listen. You are their voice, Conrad insisted, leaning closer. The smell of stale vomit and copper on Thomas was still there, but Conrad didn't flinch this time. You told them to run. Tell them to stop. Tell them they won. Thomas shook his head slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his bruised neck. You really still don't get it, do you? He looked past Conrad, looking at the glowing red map of the galaxy. They didn't start running because they wanted to win, Thomas explained, his voice rough and incredibly sad. They started running because they don't want to live in a universe where Sector 4 happens. You didn't just kill our kids, Emperor. You killed our future. A species without a future doesn't care about a ceasefire. A species without a future only cares about taking the monsters down with them. Conrad stared at the man. The logic was so fundamentally alien to the Imperial mindset, yet so horrifyingly simple. The Empire fought for territory, for resources, for order. They calculated risk and reward. The humans were no longer calculating anything. They were just reacting, a purely kinetic response to infinite grief. There must be an overriding command structure, Gregory interrupted, stepping forward, desperation leaking from every pore. A central government. We can target them. We can force a diplomatic resolution. Thomas let out a short, breathy laugh that ended in a cough. The government surrendered 3 years ago. The people flying those ships are bakers, teachers, mechanics. You can't negotiate with them because they don't want anything you have. They just want you to hurt as much as they do. Conrad stood up slowly. His joints ached. The weight of the crown, the invisible pressure of 1,000 worlds felt suddenly unbearable. He turned away from Thomas and looked back at the holographic map. 400 million dead in 3 hours. The logistics engine, the great mechanical brain that had guided the Empire's expansion for centuries, began to emit a low, persistent whine. It was overheating. It was trying to process a scenario where the enemy refused to acknowledge the basic rules of survival. It couldn't compute mutually assured destruction driven by pure, unfiltered heartbreak. "Sir," Hastings called out from the sensor station. His voice was completely broken. "We have multiple slip space ruptures detected. 12 vessels." Conrad didn't ask where they were headed. It didn't matter. The core worlds, the agricultural rings, the water harvesting moons, it was all burning. He walked slowly to the large reinforced chair at the center of the command deck. He didn't sit in it like an emperor. He slumped into it like an old man whose legs had finally given out. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. The bridge fell silent again, save for the hum of the failing logistics engine and the rapid, terrifying chirp of the proximity alarms. Conrad closed his eyes, but all he could see was the cold, dead stare of the human on the floor. He had authorized the deaths of 5,731 children to break a species' will to fight. He had succeeded. They were no longer fighting, they were just dying, and they were taking the rest of the galaxy into the dark with them. Did the chilling reality of Conrad's mistake keep you on the edge of your seat? The universe is vast, and the stories hidden within its shadows are endless. If you want more grounded, relentless, and raw sci-fi audio dramas that push the boundaries of humanity, hit that like button, subscribe to Sci-Fi Stories today, and share this video. Leave a comment below. Would you have made the same choice? Join our community and never miss a transmission.